hope to touch on some issues that are not often discussed here on the floor of the House. And along with me, I'm happy to welcome Congressman Peter DeFazio of Oregon. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Bernie.
I want to begin by touching on an issue that I believe is perhaps the most important issue facing this country. And it's not talked about enough, but it's something that all of us should be deeply concerned about. And that is, Mr. Speaker, in the last election, 36% of the American people voted. That means almost two-thirds of the American people did not believe it was important enough for their future to come out and vote. And what is even more alarming is that among people 24 years of age or younger, we had, if you can believe it, 18% of those people voting. 82% said that they were not interested in voting. And that is frightening unto itself, but it bodes very poorly for the future, because there is very good evidence that if young people do not vote, it is much less likely that they will vote in the future. So what happens in recent elections is that fewer and fewer people are participating. The vast majority of low-income people do not vote. Most working people do not vote. But then, on the other hand, you have upper-income people who do vote and upper-income people who contribute heavily to both political parties and into the political process. So the voices of working people and low-income people are virtually not heard in this institution. Their needs are not taken account of as legislation is dealt with. But for those folks who have the money, the wealthiest 1/4% who make 80% of the campaign contributions, Congress continuously does their bidding, pays attention to their needs. And I think we have a vicious circle that as Congress pays more and more attention to the needs of the wealthy and not to working people, not to the middle class, then the vast majority of the people turn off even further from the political process and say, hey, this Congress doesn't represent me, why should I vote? And tonight I want to touch on a number of issues, but before we get going, I want to yield to Mr. DeFazio. Peter?
Thanks, Bernie. Well, following on that point, the question really is, for whose benefit is the country run and the economy run? And if you asked, and I have asked groups of students in my district, now who do you think has the most impact on the economy in the United States in government? Most people would guess the president. Some talk about Secretary of Treasury. A few guess the Congress, the House, and the Senate. But virtually none say, well, Congressman, I know who it is. It's the Federal Reserve. It's that appointed, unelected group of extraordinarily wealthy individuals, for the most part, who meet in secret, and today they met in secret downtown in Washington, D.C., in their marble palace, sitting at their exotic, long boardroom table, marble and nice exotic hardwoods. And they made a decision that I suppose doesn't sound that important to most people, but the impact will be tremendous. And again, it goes essentially to who really runs this country. They decided to raise interest rates by 1/4%. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, except there are tens of millions of Americans who tomorrow will wake up to find that their mortgage rate went up, their credit card rate went up, their adjustable car loan went up. In fact, it's computed that 1/4% increase will cost a family. Here's a family that has a $100,000 mortgage, a $15,000 4-year car loan, and $2,000 on a credit card. Sounds pretty middle class to me. It'll cost them $6,913 for the mortgage, $84 on the car loan, and $16 on the credit card. $7,013. That 1/4% raise. Now, I suppose that would be justified if there was a reason to do it. What's the reason? Are we worried about inflation, which is at or near historic lows? I don't think so. It might be that the Fed is worried about higher wages, and the gentleman and I have talked about that previously. Sometimes the Federal Reserve gets worried when the unemployment rate drops below 5 or 6%. They had a rule for years saying it shouldn't go below 6%. Then they said, well, maybe 5%. They get worried because what happens if, unemployment drops?
Well, what will happen then is, horror of all horrors, wages may go up. And let me just touch on that very important point. We hear every day on the television, we hear it on the radio, we read it in the newspapers, that we are living in the midst of one of the great economic booms in our history. And maybe that fear that with low unemployment wages might go up has in fact prompted the Federal Reserve to do what it did today. But I want to, for the record, Mr. Speaker, give you a chart which very clearly belies this nonsense that there is an economic boom for the middle class or for working people. According to information assembled by the Economic Policy Institute, and I don't think there is a lot of debate about this, in 1973, the weekly earnings, the real average weekly earnings of workers in the United States was $502, okay? In 1973, the weekly earnings, average earnings, were $502. In 1998, in the midst of a great economic boom, the weekly earnings were $442, a 12% reduction in real wages. And the reality is that in order to compensate for the lowering of real wages, the average American today is working significantly more hours. People are working 2 jobs. People are working 3 jobs. So if the Fed thinks that they have got to once again increase unemployment to dampen wage increases, I would have very strong disagreement, because in reality today, the average person in the middle class is struggling. You and I have discussed this before. It's true in Oregon. It's true in Vermont. How many people that we know are working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, 50, 60, 70 hours a week to pay the bills? And the idea that anybody in a public position of trust would take action which would result in lowering wages, forcing people to work even longer hours, is, to my mind, an outrage. And I would yield.
Well, let's think about that then again. So if this unelected group, the Federal Reserve Board, who meets in secret, some of whom work for banks and in fact can individually or profit their employer without any conflict of interest rules. Now, if they raised interest rates, and they didn't raise them because wages are running away and people are seeing big increases in their wages, they must have had another reason. And the pundits tell me that perhaps that other reason is that they're worried about the bubble in the stock market. Now, I've got a little problem with that. Now, the question is, if you whack the people on Main Street by raising again, as these statistics show, their payment for their $100,000 mortgage, $15,000 car loan, and $2,000 credit card, and a lot of folks have a lot more than that on their credit card, if they're going to pay $7,000 more for those loans because of this 0.25% increase, now how is that going to somehow translate to a message to the people on Wall Street, the speculators, who are driving up the, what did Greenspan call it, irrational exuberance on Wall Street? If he's worried about the irrational exuberance on Wall Street, why didn't he do something about Wall Street? They've got the tools. Right now on Wall Street, if you've got a $1,000 investment, you can, on margin, go out and buy a whole bunch more stock. They could control that. There's steps they could take to directly control, but no, they're going to whack the people on Main Street and say, see, we're going to cause some of you to lose your jobs, drive up unemployment, maybe we'll drive down wages. We're going to cause this disruption in the economy, and we're hoping that that will percolate up to Wall Street. This is kind of a bizarre way to run an economy, but I think it has something to do with who they work for, the major banks, and what lack of control the Congress has. No one knows what the Federal Reserve does or why they do it. It's all secret. Congress has ceded all authority to them in the making of money and controlling interest rates and basically managing the economy. and they're managing it for their banker friends who are deathly afraid of inflation or deathly afraid of higher wages for the corporate CEOs, but not for average folks. I think that's an extraordinary turn of event, and I think it brings us back again to who makes the contributions, who basically runs this organization when it comes to election time, and to whom are many of our colleagues beholden. And it unfortunately is not the average people on Main Street, but it's those people on Wall Street, it's those people in the banking industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, and others. In fact, I noted today in the paper that banking industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, and others. In fact, I noted today in the paper that in this presidential race, George W. May not even take public matching funds because he has raised so much money and intends to raise so much money, obscene amounts of money. It's flowing in so fast they can't count it, that you know, he just doesn't think he'll need those public matching funds and those constraints on spending. Now you got to wonder who those people are contributing all that money and what they expect to get in return.
Well, let me interrupt my friend, if I might, by giving some facts and figures. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to also enter for the record information about campaign contributions and lobbying expenses. Now, last week, and I hope to get into this a little bit, you and I talked about the issue of pharmaceutical drugs, about the crisis that exists all over the United States, where you have elderly people and people with chronic illnesses who cannot afford the high cost of prescription drugs. We talked about the fact that the same exact drug manufactured in the United States of America is sold for significantly lower prices in Canada, in Mexico, and in Europe, and that the American consumer is being ripped off. We talked about the huge profits of the pharmaceutical industry and the fact that the United States is perhaps the only major nation on earth that does not regulate the price that pharmaceutical companies can sell their product. And lo and behold, apropos of what you were talking about, now let's just see how money works and the relationship to the very high cost of prescription drugs in this country and to lobbying expenses and campaign contributions. It turns out that for the first 18 months of the last election cycle, the pharmaceutical industry had lobbying expenses of over $74 million and made more than $7 million in campaign contributions, which put them at the very top of any industry in America. So if consumers want to know why we are paying so much more for the exact same prescription drug in this country as the Canadians and the Mexicans and the Europeans do, then they might well look to the reality that the pharmaceutical industry is pouring huge sums of money, not only into Congress, but into state legislatures throughout this country. They are number one. They are at the very top of the list of people who spend money on lobbying expenditures or campaign contributions, followed, I might ask, not very far behind, by the insurance industry, which might help us explain why we are the only nation in the entire industrialized world that does not have a national health insurance system. So whether the issue is banking, whether the issue is interest rates, whether the issue is the high cost of pharmaceutical drugs, or all of the other absurd priorities that exist in this Congress, I think one of the important factors to examine is who makes the campaign contributions, who puts money into lobbying, and that tells us a whole lot about the end results which we see. I yield.
Well, since you raised the insurance industry, some of our colleagues spoke at an earlier hour about the need for a patient's Bill of Rights. And as you pointed out, the insurance industry is the second greatest funder of congressional campaigns and has been particularly generous to the majority party. And we found in the last Congress that we were able to get a very truncated patient's Bill of Rights through the House, and the Senate did not act at all because of the fear on the part of the insurance companies that it might impinge upon their profits. Let's just talk for a minute about what that means. That means, and I've talked to some folks from the Heart Association who are very concerned, they spent years educating Americans to, when they've got that pain, they should go to the emergency room. Well, guess what? Now with an HMO, you don't go to the emergency room. You're supposed to call the insurance company first in some plans and talk to a clerk somewhere who you may have awakened from their late evening nap, and ask them for permission to go to the emergency room, and sometimes it's denied. Take an aspirin and call your doctor in the morning. The Heart Association is very worried about the message we're sending here. So part of the patient's Bill of Rights is called a prudent person rule. If you've got an extreme pain in your chest and you think you're having a heart attack, you don't have to call a clerk who works for the insurance company to get permission to go to the emergency room. Of course, they say they don't deny permission, they just won't pay for it if you go. Now, how many Americans can afford a $500 or $1,000 visit to the emergency room? Not very many. So, this is extraordinary. So that's one thing in the patient's Bill of Rights. There was another case in Virginia, a young woman who fell off a cliff, broke her back. They medevaced her by helicopter. When she got to the hospital, they worked on her right away. She was in serious condition. Her insurance company later refused to pay because she lacked prior authorization. And I asked, well, when was she supposed to make the call? On her cell phone as she fell through the air? Or perhaps maybe she should have asked to use the radio in the helicopter while she was being medevaced. No, these are absurd things. These are no-brainers for the American people. We should have the right, we pay our insurance premiums, to have that kind of fair treatment. But guess what? The insurance industry doesn't think so, and a majority of my colleagues here in Congress don't think so, because they're much more attentive to the insurance industry than they are to the needs of their constituents. That's an outrage, and that should change. And I'm one of many who have signed a petition here on the House to force a patient's Bill of Rights to the floor of the House because the Republican leadership refuses to let the bill be heard. We have over 180 people on that bill, and I tell you, we will not be denied. And if the American people would begin to speak up to their representatives, they would not. But again, we're back in this circular situation where the people who fund the campaigns have more at risk and are more likely to be heard than the people who are being denied the care in their insurance plan.
The gentleman touches on perhaps the most fundamental issue that we can discuss. And that is, in the midst of all of the media hoopla about how great the economy is doing, the reality is that there are tens and tens of millions of people who are hurting very badly, and in many ways are in worse shape today than they were 20 or 25 years ago. And you're touching on one area, and that is the area of healthcare. Now, I want to know one simple thing. It would seem to me that if the economy is booming, what that would translate to, among other things, is an improved health care system for all of the people. Makes sense to me. Economy is booming. That means that more and more people have health insurance, better quality of health care, better able to go to the physician of their choice, the specialists of their choice, more access to prescription drugs. That's what a booming economy would seem to me. But the reality, as you have just indicated, is very much not that. The reality is that we have some 43 million Americans who have zero health insurance. The reality is that we have tens of millions of Americans who have very large deductibles and co-payments. And that means that if they get sick, they hesitate to go to the doctor because they don't have the cash to pay for the visit. And the end result of that is that doctors now tell us that the patients that they are seeing are far sicker than the patients that they used to see because people don't have the money to pay because they have high deductibles. In terms of prescription drugs, once again, at a time when the average profits in 1998 for the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies in this country were $2.5 billion. That was the average profits for the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies. You have people in the state of Vermont, people all over this country, elderly folks, sick people who literally have got to make the choice as to whether they purchase the prescription drugs they need to keep them alive, to ease their pain, or whether they heat their homes in the winter, whether they buy the food that they need. But the pharmaceutical industry, enjoying huge profits, has all kinds of money available for campaign contributions to maintain the status quo. I would like to submit to the record, Mr. Speaker, a chart, which I think the American people would be interested in hearing about, which talks about how much more senior citizens in the United States pay for prescription drugs than do seniors in other nations. If a product used, the average or one of the more commonly used prescription drugs in this country used by seniors cost $1. In Germany, that product costs 71 cents. In Sweden, 68 cents. In the United Kingdom, 65 cents. Canada, 64 cents. France, 57 cents. And Italy, 51 cents. But once again, getting back to your point, if we're talking about a so-called booming economy, I would think that what the healthcare system would be doing is making it easier for people to get in, making it easier for people to get the quality care. And as we both know, as a result of the growth of managed care and HMOs, that is very often exactly the opposite of what is happening. And I would yield to my friend.
Well, part of the problem there, I want to go back to the point about the seniors and the cost of drugs, but just on the issue of access to health care and the fact that so many people have been deprived of access to health care. Part of the problem is the fact that more and more Americans are working in temporary jobs. Right. In fact, the number of Americans in the last 25 years holding temporary jobs without benefits instead of full-time jobs with benefits has gone up by a factor of 8. 8 times as many people. The largest employer in America now is not General Motors, it's not Microsoft, it is a Manpower Inc., a temporary employer. Now, those people are forced to take jobs generally at wages lower than what they earned in their last full-time job with no benefits, including no insurance benefits. Now, that's a crisis for many families in this country, and that's something that needs to be dealt with. They say, well, you know, if they had insurance at their last job, they can purchase it under COBRA. Yeah, that's right. We did provide relief for a few people with a federal law that says they can purchase the same health care they had. But guess what? When people lose their jobs, most people can't afford $350 a month premiums to come out of their unemployment insurance and still put food on the table, pay the rent, and pay the light bill. They can't afford that. But talking about that, seniors, I've done recently, with the help of the gentleman, Henry Waxman from California, a survey of seniors in my district in terms of the prices they're paying for commonly prescribed drugs for seniors. And the results are absolutely extraordinary. I'll be releasing the survey next week. But it turns out that many seniors are paying 4 to 7 times as much as people who have health insurance, full health insurance, for exactly the same drugs over the counter. Now, there's something wrong with that. The insurance companies have gone to the pharmaceutical industry and bargained a good price. They're getting a great price. The senior walks in and buys the same prescription over the counter, sometimes a essential life-saving prescription, and they're paying 4 to 7 times more. They cannot afford it. The president is trying to deal with that in his proposal for a minimal beginning of prescription drug coverage. That would be an improvement over the current system. But much more can and should be done. Dealing with the prices these insurance companies charge, the gentleman has tried for a number of years to make a very simple principle. A lot of drugs are developed after the public has spent a lot of money developing the research for particular drugs. In fact, one drug that is very effective for uterine cancer was developed by the National Institutes for Health. All the research was done, all the processes on how to make it. The bark out of which the first drugs were made before they developed an artificial process came off of federal land. So we have the taxpayers paid to discover and develop the process for the drug. Taxpayers own the property for which the natural substance, the bark, is coming from. And guess what? The federal government gave an exclusive right to Bristol Myers Squibb to market this drug with no price caps. And guess what? With no sunk costs, they didn't go through a lengthy development process, and very low cost to get the product. They were charging outrageous prices because women desperate with this type of cancer needed the drug. Now, the gentleman has proposed simple principle. They should repay the Treasury for that research. They should repay the taxpayers. Now, have we had, has that become law? It seems to me that most Americans would agree that would be fair.
I would say that the pharmaceutical industry, which spends some over $80 million in the last election cycle, in opposition to any serious reform, was successful in helping to defeat that proposal. But we will be back, and we're going to be back with another good proposal. And that is that one of the outrages that currently exists, as I mentioned earlier, is that the same exact prescription drug manufactured by an American company is sold in Canada, Mexico, and around the world for far lower prices than it is sold in the United States. And I know the gentleman intends to release a study in Oregon, but we have already released one in the state of Vermont. And what we found that is for the most commonly used prescription drugs that senior citizens need, in Vermont, those drugs cost 81% more than in Canada, and 112% more than in Mexico. And in response to that absurdity, I have introduced legislation which would allow American pharmaceutical distributors to be able to purchase their products from Canada, from Mexico, and from any other country to take advantage of the lower prices so they could resell those products back in the United States at far lower prices than is currently the case. So that I know the gentleman knows the problem here is not with the independent pharmacist. That person has no choice but to sell the product for a high price because he's purchasing it for a high price. Well, now we're going to let competition reign. Now we're going to let the distributors buy at a lower price in Canada, Mexico, or any place else. This is exactly the same product that is sold in the United States for a far higher price. And I should mention that, in matter of fact, on July 7th, I intend to take a van of senior citizens and people with chronic health problems to Canada. It's only an hour and a half away from us. We're going to go to Montreal, and we're going to purchase prescription drugs. And we're going to show the degree to which prices in Canada are so much lower than they are in the United States. In my state, already many people are going over the border to Canada to take advantage of the lower prices. I know in the southern part of this country, people are going to Mexico. That is an absurdity. Americans should not have to skip over the border, north or south, in order to get a discount on drugs manufactured by American pharmaceutical companies. That is an outrage. And we're going to do everything that we can to see that the American consumer is treated the same way that the Canadians, the Mexicans, and the Europeans are treated. And I would yield back.
Is the gentleman telling me that these are exactly the same drugs that would be available? These must be generics or something like that.
These are the same drugs manufactured in the same factory, often in the same bottle, often in Puerto Rico. The same exact products. I want the pharmaceutical industry to tell the American people why, if you go to Europe, if you go to Mexico, if you go to Canada, you can purchase the product that you sometimes need to stay alive. You and I both know of the horror stories of people struggling to combat their illnesses, a question of life and death, and not being able to afford these outrageously high prices. And as you indicated a moment ago, to add insult to injury, the taxpayers of this country pour huge sums of money into research and development, and then when they develop the product, instead of saying to the pharmaceutical company that's going to distribute it, that's going to sell it, you have to sell that product because it was developed with taxpayer money. You have to sell that product at a reasonable price. Instead of that, the NIH gives the product over to the pharmaceutical industry, who then sells it at any price that they want, meaning that the taxpayer who helped to develop the drug often cannot even afford to purchase the drug that he or she developed, which is an issue that must be addressed.
I've also recently found out, which causes me great concern in my district, that there's a problem with retired military getting their prescriptions filled. We have no active military base in Oregon, and they are not eligible for a mail order program, which is maintained by the military. So what they've been doing is pooling together with volunteers to go up to Washington State with all their prescriptions, and then have a person go and fill a couple of hundred prescriptions and load them in a van and drive them back down to Oregon. Now, I mean, this is another example of Americans who been made a promise, in this case, veterans. We'll take care of you. We'll take care of you for life. And they are not getting their prescriptions filled. In fact, the VA or the military has proposed that they don't want to have this volunteer van service anymore. And I said, well, then how about making these people eligible for mail order prescriptions. Like, I've got a Blue Cross Blue Shield card. I can get stuff out of some pharmacy in Florida for an absurdly cheap price if I want to wait a week or 10 days. I said, how about, you know, the VA or the military setting up something like that? Well, you know, that's difficult. We're still fighting over that. But that's just another category of people that are getting hit. They can't afford to go to the pharmacy and buy these things. They've got to get them through the military, and now they're being told they can't do that.
Well, the gentleman touches on an issue that I know that both of us have worked on, and that is veterans' rights. And this gets again back to the issue of the so-called booming economy and the priorities being established in the Congress. Now, it seems to me that in terms of veterans, these are men and women who have put their lives on the line. They did what their government asked them to do. They signed a contract, sometimes in blood, with the United States government. And I regard it as completely unacceptable that the government reneges on the contract that it signed with those people. And when we talk about priorities, when we talk about the so-called booming economy, I find it hard to understand how any member of this Congress could support, on one hand, huge tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country, who in recent years have seen extraordinary increases in their wealth, and then with the other hand, say to the veterans of this country, well, gee, I guess we're having problems with your prescription drugs. We just don't have the money to help you. We may have to downsize your hospital. We may have to cut back on the quality of care that we give you. Now, what a sense of priorities it is to say to millionaires and billionaires, oh, we hear your pain. We are going to give you huge tax breaks, but to the veterans of this country, to the senior citizens of this country, to the working people of this country, gee, we're sorry, we just don't have the funds to help you in your hour of need. Now, we talked about health care, we've talked about prescription drugs, we've talked about the Federal Reserve. We could go on and on, but the bottom line is that what goes on in this country increasingly is that the people on the top are doing extraordinarily well. The people in the middle are working longer hours for low wages, and the people down below are hurting very severely. I find it basically wrong, and there's no other word that I can use, that in the United States of America today, we have the most unfair distribution of wealth and the most unfair distribution of income in any industrialized society. We have a situation in which the wealthiest 1% of the population now own 40% of the total wealth of this nation, which is more than the bottom 95%. Richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 95%. And as the gentleman knows, in recent years, we have given huge tax breaks to upper-income people at the same time as we have cut back on the needs of our veterans. We have cut back on the needs of many, many other people. So when I go back to Vermont, what people say to me, they say, middle-class people are saying, gee, we can't afford to send our kids to college. How come you can be in a Congress which can provide huge tax breaks for those people who really don't need it? So I think we've got to get our priorities right. And what our priorities should mean is that we should join, in my view, the rest of the major countries in this world and say that health care is a right of citizenship, not a radical idea. That every man, woman, and child should be entitled to health care because they are citizens of this country, that we should be putting more money into higher education so that middle-class families do not have to go deeply into debt to send their kids to college, so that the young people do not have to get out of college $20,000, $30,000, or $40,000 in debt. So I would suggest that maybe the Congress want to start focusing on the needs of ordinary people rather than just those people who make the campaign contributions.
Well, I'm surprised we got back to campaign contributions, but I think the gentleman is making an excellent point. Again, the question is, on behalf of whom does this body make policy day in and day out, and to whom is the majority beholden? They're talking about a vision. They have a vision for a future, a tax system, which the gentleman was just talking about. And it's an interesting vision. And the vision is that we should do away with death taxes. Of course, in the last Congress, we acted so that anyone with assets of less than $1 million in the very near future will be subject to no death taxes. But they're worried about those people with assets of over $1 million that they might have to pay taxes upon transferring them to their heirs. So their vision is we would do away with all inheritance tax and then would reduce the capital gains tax to zero. Now here's the ultimate absurdity, and this is not about wealth envy or something else. It's about everybody carrying their fair share of the burden in our society. And somewhat, that depends upon the ability to pay. You can only squeeze so much out of a minimum wage worker. But if someone has a lot of discretionary income, they can afford to pay a little bit more. But in their vision that they've put forward to us, zero inheritance tax and zero capital gains tax. Now let's just say if someone was lucky enough to be, well, let's say Bill Gates' child. That person, and he says he's going to give most of the money away into charitable undertakings, and that's wonderful, and I think the American people will appreciate that gift. But let's just say he reserves $1 billion for his child, and the child gets $1 billion when they graduate from college. Well, under this vision of the future, that child would pay $0 on taxes for the inheritance. And if that child chose to invest the money for a living as opposed to working for wages, they would pay $0 in federal taxes, $0 in FICA taxes. So it sort of begs the question, as the elite make more and more of their money off unearned income, why is it that wage-earning people have to pay 28 or 31%, or even the people at the top 39.6% of their income in taxes, but these other people who don't have to work for wages, who are lucky enough or skillful enough to just live on unearned income, pay at the rate today of 18% with a vision of going to zero?
Is the gentleman, let me see if I understand what the gentleman is saying. It's a very radical concept. You're suggesting that somebody who works by the sweat of their brow for 50, 60, 70 hours a week, trying to make $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year to maintain their family at a level of dignity and decency, are you suggesting that those people should be paying less in taxes than people who make millions of dollars investing in the stock market?
Well, I wasn't even taking it that far. What I'm saying is if a person who earns, that's an interesting point.
That's a radical,
but well, that's pretty radical. The gentleman sometimes is known to be out there a little bit. But let me take it back to a simpler prospect. A person who works 50 hours a week as, say, a retail clerk and brings home $40,000, $50,000 a year in a good union job, that's possible. They pay a rate of... Oh, a message from the President, certainly. We're most anxious to hear from
the chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the President of the United States.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Secretary.
I'm directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
Gentleman from Vermont may resume. Thank you.
I hope the President is not saying that we should cease our discussion.
I hope it's a veto message on some bad legislation we've passed recently. But back to this point. Let's simplify it. Let's not even go to the issue of someone with a very large income and someone with a modest income. Let's say two people earn $40,000 a year. One earns $40,000 a year by investing money they inherited. The other earns $40,000 a year by working 40 hours a week in a wage-earning job. The person who earns $40,000 a year is paying taxes at about the rate of 28%, and the person who invests for a living is paying 18%. Now, I have a hard time understanding why that's fair. Why the person who doesn't work for wages pays a lower rate. And of course, if the person who works for wages is self-employed, not only do they get socked with a 28% rate, they also get socked with paying the FICA tax on both sides. So their tax rate suddenly jumps up around 40 to 50%, where again, the person who's investing for, but their vision for the future is those that 1% or so who can just live off of investments should pay no taxes to the federal government. Now, my question would be, how then are we going to maintain the government, and who's going to pay?
Well, I think while it is certainly not fair, it is understandable. Because once again, we have got to deal with the reality that the wealthiest 1/4% of the population make 80% of the campaign contributions. And unless I would be very mistaken, and I don't think I am, when these guys kick in $50 or $100 or $1 million and their corporate friends kick in huge sums of money to both political parties, maybe that is the reason that they are making those contributions. After all, I mean, imagine just trying to live on a couple of $100 million a year when you can get a tax break and earn even more money. My guess is that when they go to these $50,000 a plate fundraising dinners, they're not sitting there saying, raise the minimum wage, that's why we gave you $50,000, provide health care to all people, expand the Pell Grants, cut the cost of pharmaceuticals so that ordinary folks can afford it. My guess would be that people who contribute huge sums of money to the political parties are not quite so interested in the needs of the middle class and working families of this country, but rather their own interest. And one of their own interests is to pay less and less and less in taxes, and that certainly has happened in recent years.
Well, certainly then we can expect that we'll take up campaign finance reform soon here on the floor of the House.
Well, we certainly would like to do so, but once again, money is talking. The American people in poll after poll say they want changes in the obscenity of the current campaign finance system. But the moneyed folks, hey, they like the system the way it is. See, in a democracy, you have one person, one vote. If you have money, if you don't have money, you get one vote. But in the current system, you have one person, one vote, but then the other person has one vote plus the ability to contribute endless sums of money and have access and impact on the legislative process. So for those folks who have the money, they don't want to see campaign finance reform, and it is a real outrage that the House leadership has refused to bring back onto the floor a reasonably conservative bill that would ban soft money that passed overwhelmingly here last year. They don't want to bring it back. And they're going to wait and wait so that it will become impossible for the Senate to act. And we'll continue this charade by which big money pours into both parties and to the presidential candidates, and which government continues to work on the needs of upper-income people rather than the middle class.
Well, the gentleman's making an excellent point there, and it is very disturbing to me and many other members of this chamber. And I believe the gentleman has probably signed what's called a discharge petition. That is, a majority of members of this House, if made to vote, would vote for campaign finance reform. But the leaders of the Republican Party are attempting to protect their members from making that vote. In the last Congress, Speaker Gingrich managed to delay, and Tom DeLay managed to offer many mischievous amendments. But ultimately, finally, the House passed its judgment. And as the gentleman says, overwhelmingly, faced with the obscenity of today's campaign finance system, an overwhelmingly majority of this House said, we have to take these minimal steps toward reform. Our constituents demand it. But now, here we are, a little more than a year later, same place, a majority support reform, but we can't get a bill to the floor of the House. And the Speaker says, well, I'll only bring it up later in the year, late enough so that we know it won't go anywhere in the Senate, and then we'll be launched into the presidential campaign year, and we all know that we're not going to reform campaigns in the middle of the most expensive presidential campaign in the history of the United States.
And what is really very clear, I don't think there's any debate on this, is the Speaker and the House leadership understands that if that bill came before the House, as you've just indicated, the vast majority of the people would vote for it because they would be embarrassed to go back home and say, we voted against campaign finance reform. But if it doesn't come before the floor of the House, they don't have to make that vote. Now, we're running out of time, and I wonder, the gentleman from Oregon has recently made, I think, a very important contribution in terms of this whole discussion over Social Security. As the gentleman knows, we hear very often about how Social Security is going bankrupt, there's no money in it, and blah, 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 which happens to be untrue. Right now, if the United States Congress does nothing, which I think is not a good idea, I think we should act, Social Security will be able to pay out every benefit owed to every eligible American for the next 34 years. So that is not a system on the verge of bankruptcy. But as we become an older society and as people live longer, there are problems that we must address. And I know the gentleman has just recently introduced very, I think, interesting Social Security legislation. Would you like to say a word on that?
And just one point beyond that, for people who are being stampeded into the idea that we have to destroy the system to save it, even if Congress did nothing, as the gentleman says, for 35 years, Social Security could deliver on 100% of promised benefits, and after that, 73 to 75% of promised benefits into the indefinite future. That means it has a 25% problem that starts 35 years from now. Does that sound like a system we need to destroy? The most successful social system this country's ever seen, that's been responsible for lifting tens of millions of seniors out of poverty?
I find it ironic and very interesting that time and time again, and I guess we're not going to have time today to talk about corporate control over the media, a dear subject to me.
Next time.
Next time. But I find it amazing that we hear Social Security, crisis, bankrupt, no money available. And the young people, by and large, believe this by now because they've heard it so much, when what we have just, there's no debate. If the Congress does nothing, Social Security will pay out every nickel owed to every eligible American for the next 34 years. Well, we have crises today. We have people sleeping out on the street. Elderly people can't afford their prescription drugs. Veterans are not getting the health care they need. But those apparently are not crises. But this non-crisis is now being subjected to a situation where people want draconian response, which would destroy the system. But maybe you want to say a few words.
And I would posit something, but I do want to explain my plan, that has something to do with the fact that if it were broken up into 70 to 80 million pieces, that there would be an awful lot of commissions out there for brokers. And all the intense pressure here in Congress to break Social Security up and make it into individual accounts is coming from Wall Street, the same people, of course, who are contributing tremendous amounts of money to people's campaigns. But let me explain a simple fix for Social Security. About half the American people pay more in Social Security taxes to the federal government than they do income taxes. We should deal with that issue. We should give them some tax relief. Now, we also want to make certain that the system is solvent for the future. So I've put those two ideas together. If we did one thing, if we lifted the cap, right now if you earn $72,600, you pay Social Security on every penny you earn. If you earn $15,000, $20,000, $40,000, up to $72,600, Social Security on every penny you earn. If you earn $1 million, you only pay Social Security on the first $72,600. That means your effective rate of tax is less than 1%, and it's over 6% for Social Security alone, not the Medicare portion, for individuals who earn $20,000 a year. So lift that cap. If you lift the cap and say fair is fair, everybody will pay the same amount on all they earn. That sounds like the flat tax that my colleagues over here are always pushing. Then that would raise more than enough money to fix the system and make it solvent forever. But I want to take some of that money and invest it in tax relief. We could also exempt the first $4,000 of earnings for every wage-earning American. That means everybody who earns less than $76,600 a year, that's 95% of wage-earning Americans, would get a tax break under this proposal. And then with a few other changes in Social Security, investing some aggregate amount of the surplus, taking away from Congress, which borrows it and spends it and replaces it with IOUs, into index funds and other investments, we could assure, and I have a letter from Social Security saying my plan would do this, the solvency of Social Security for 75 years, which is as far out as they project it, while providing tax relief to 95% of Americans. And I also deal with two other problems. I give 5 child care dropout years so that families that can't afford child care and choose to stay home with their kids in their formative years will not be penalized on their ultimate Social Security benefit. And then finally, a slight increase in benefits for people over the age of 85 who are at a very high rate of poverty. We could do all that by lifting the cap on the wages. That is, everybody pays the same amount. But unfortunately, I believe that a lot of those people we're talking about who finance the campaigns are probably in that same category.
Very interesting. You know, they do polls and they ask the American people, how do you think we should deal with the Social Security situation? One alternative is to raise the age at which you get benefits. The other solution is to cut back on benefits. And the American people respond. And then they say, well, what about raising the cap? Exactly what you're talking about. Poll after poll shows the American people think that is a very good idea. They think it's appropriate. And as you just indicated, if you raise the cap, not only can you can create Social Security solvency for the 75 years that the actuaries want, you could actually have a tax deduction for low and medium income workers, which makes a lot of sense to me. But amazingly, despite the fact that this is an idea that the American people want, how many people in the Congress are even prepared to talk about that idea? Not a whole lot.
Well, I'm circulating a letter to all our colleagues this week asking them to sign on to the bill, which I will introduce when we return from the July 4th break. And I think that, certainly there will be many who are interested in a progressive Social Security reform, a way to cut taxes for 95% of wage-earning Americans and assure the future of Social Security for generations to come. Sounds like a pretty good deal to me, and we'll see if for once we can overcome the influence of those few wealthy people who spend so much financing the campaigns, particularly on the majority side of the aisle here.
Well, I think we're coming toward the end of our time, and I want to thank Congressman Peter DeFazio for all of the work he does in the Congress and for his participation this evening. But I would like to conclude on this note. We have touched on a number of problems, but that does not make us pessimistic. It is my belief, and I know I speak for Peter as well, that if working people and middle-income people and young people get involved in the political process, if they let the Congress and the President hear from them, if they make the political leaders of this country understand what their needs are, and they get involved, we can turn this country around. We should not be proud that the wealthiest people have seen huge increases in their income and their wealth at the same time as we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any industrialized nation. We should not be proud that 43 million Americans have no health insurance and that we are the only country in the industrialized world without a national health insurance system. We should not be proud that the CEOs make over 300 times what their workers make, and that in the midst of the so-called economic boom, the average American worker today is earning less than was the case 25 years ago. But ultimately, to turn that around, to make the government of the United States work for the middle class, work for working families, rather than for upper-income people, people are going to have to get involved in the process. They're going to have to vote. They're going to have to be informed about the issues. They're going to have to run for office. They're going to have to revitalize American democracy and pay tribute to the founders of this country who gave us the radical concept of democracy. So I would hope that all of our people, especially the young people who are turning their backs to our democratic system, get involved and stand up and fight for the rights of ordinary people. And I thank the gentleman for joining me this evening.